Hi and hello everybody. Today we have been seen about the topic on fracture of a material. The fracture, the word is very familiar to everybody. The fracture happened in materials, machines, also in our human body. So today we have deeply discussed about what is fracture and what are all the types of fractures and how to resist the fracture and what are all the steps happen while fracturing the materials. Okay, let's go on to the session. First, the fracture. Fracture is an separation of an object or a material into two or more pieces under the action of stress. We are the engineers need to understand the fracture mechanics which occurred in the specific condition and can cause the major damages of the material. Fracture is the mechanical failure of a material which will produce the separation or fragmentation of a solid into a two or more parts under the action of stresses. Next, we have been deeply discussed about the what are all the types of fracture. The types of fractures means ductile fracture, brittle fracture, fatigue fracture and creep fracture. Before going to that, we have been known about what is ductility. Ductility is the ability of a material to be elongated in the tension. Ductile material will deform more than the brittle material. The ductile material shows the large deformation before the fracture. Next, brittle material. Brittle materials, when subjected to a stress, break with the little elastic deformation without significant plastic deformation. It also absorbs relatively little energy prior to the fracture. Next, what are all the steps happened? Next, we have been move about the brittle fracture. Brittle fracture occurs suddenly and catastrophically without any warning. Fracture occur without any deformation. Most of the amorphous materials like glasses having this kind of fracture. Crystalline material having deformation before brittle. Brittle fracture increased with increase in the temperature and increasing the strain rate of an material. In brittle fracture, no apparent plastic deformation has been formed and also no crack formation, no propagation that has been formed. In the brittle materials, the cracks are unstable. The cracks are very unstable. Best example is the Titanic ship. Due to the cold temperature of that sea during that night time, the steel of an ship has been converted into the brittle material, so it can be break easily while during that time, so that the ship can be falls down. Next, grip theory. There is a difference between material strength to the theoretical value of the ideal material. This is due to fine cracks in the material. The stresses applied on the material is concentrated more on crack portions and lead it to a fracture. That is, when the stress at the tip of the crack exceeds the theoretical stress value and crack expansion in the materials is mainly converted on the what are all the fractures and what are all the steps happen during the fractures has been discussed in this theory. Ductile fracture. Ductile fracture is the important thing we have been noted in the fracture. The ductile fracture indicates the different steps and the what are all the stages happened in the ductility. During ductile fracture, There are three different stages: elongation, formation of cavities, and then formation of central cracks also will happen. This has been discussed in the diagram. Then crack propagation will be formed, then also fracture will be occurred at the end. Prevention of a ductile fracture. Prevention of a ductile fracture leads to the material should have a fine grain size. Due to the in order of the fine grain size, the ductile fracture will occur. Then they should have high hardness value. The ductile material should have the high hardness value. Next, it should have a higher Young modulus and cohesive energy. Then it have defects and dislocations happen. Now we can briefly discuss about the ductile fracture. Ductile fracture means the ductile material, the fractures will happen. There are 5 steps which have been happened in the ductile fracture. The ductile fracture in which first of all the elongation will happen due to the tensile strength acting on a material. Next, the crack propagation will be started. During that there will be a cavity formation. Next, we have been seen about the cavity formation will result in the fracture, in the ductile fracture. This is usually occurs as an actual fracture. The observation of massive amount of energy will be happened and then slower propagation will be starts. In the ductile fracture, the material will result in the irregular and indefinite shape of cracks will be formed. Then the mass amount of energy will be absorbed during the ductile fracture. The ductile fracture mainly occurs in the steel materials like aluminium and then elastic materials like rubber and hardened steel. Like this material, the fractures will occur. Ductile fractures will sustain in the plastic deformation when the plastic materials has been relatively hard and then inclusion which do not deform at the same rate. When the material contains relatively hard inclusions which do not deform at the same rate as the matrix, voids are nucleated and accommodated incompletely. The nucleation even may involve for the fracture of the inclusion. Overall, the fracture of an ductile is a macroscopic sample does not occur until the voids nucleated from different inclusions have grown sufficiently. When the ductile fracture, the surface is examined, the appearance is of dimples. This of dimples has been shown in the diagram. It is frequently possible to observe the inclusion responsible for nucleating the void within the depth of the dimple. Next, the dimples will change into the cavity, like central crack has been formed at the neck portion of an object. Then the crack and the central portion crack will propagate to the entire surface of a material. Finally, the fracture occur at an end. Then the material can be split into the 2 parts. This is the general structural study and these general processes happened in the ductile fracture. So in this session we have been seen about the what are all the types of fractures, what is fracture, and what are all the preventions. The prevention should be the grain size should be fine, the higher hardness value and higher Young's modulus and cohesive energy, and do not have any defects, like the prevention of ductile fracture and how the brittle fractures occurred and what are all the stages has been occurred in the ductile fracture also has been discussed. Finally, I will say thank you and have a pleasant day. Thank you all. We will see in the next